It seems that because I'm so totally convinced that we must, it's imperative that we leave the European Union, it seems I am being asked to expand and to explain my reasoning. It's not difficult to do, and it's not something I don't want to do, but it's not something that I think the British people are necessarily willing to listen to. Now, why aren't they willing to listen to a reasoned argument? Well, it's because for the last 50 years, we've been led by people who told us that black was white and expected us to put our cross in the appropriate box at the next general election. And sadly, that's exactly what we've done. I'm astonished by it. I gave up voting for any of our political parties. I wanted a box on the ballot box that said none of the above. These people are pygmies. They lack the intellect and understanding, it would appear, of our general situation in the world. What they've done is to say, we're never mind, let's bother about doing anything about our lot in the world. We're safer, it's easier. Stay inside up into the European Union and stay there. Become a satellite of Germany. It doesn't matter really, but of course it doesn't matter to most of them. At the end of their so-called careers, they'll up stumps and leave what's left of this country and go and live somewhere in the sun. It's simple enough. What I'm concerned about is my children, grandchildren and their children. They're British, and they should retain that identity. And the idea that it's incompatible for us to retain that identity and still have a future in the world, of course, is total nonsense. But having voted to get out of this silly idea of being controlled by third parties, and on the pretense that if we sit down round a table with 27 other people, we're going to get logic to prevail, is such nonsense. It's very difficult to believe. I don't want to continually put my money on a 28-to-1 shot, or whatever the odds are, because they're enormous. So we have to understand that for the last 50 years we've been subjected to so much superficial nonsense from our so-called leaders that we've become conditioned to it. And I'm aware of that fact, and therefore I know when I present the picture of what we have to do in the next few years, there's a distinct possibility that that people are simply going to say, well, what does he know about it? I mean, it's not a problem, that we're obviously safer and we'll lose thousands of jobs if we're not. It's absolute arrant nonsense. And all that sort of talk is going to be sitting there against me. But I'll nonetheless press ahead and then I shall leave it at that. As far as I'm concerned, if we stay with no future at all, then that's what we're being asked to accept. There's no doubt about it, that's the way it is. No future at all. So, what do we have to do? First of all, we get out of this so-called union in order to press those people who try to stand for our parliament to actually conduct themselves in the interest of Great Britain. And I don't mean pay lip service to it, I mean actually set about trying to do that. We've watched, since Margaret Thatcher, we've watched our industrial base just simply squandered away as if it didn't matter. In fact, there was talk that the service industry in London as a financial centre were enough. We didn't need manufacturing industry, we've got such expertise, etc. The world holds us in such high regard, etc. Such nonsense. But it was trotted out there on a regular basis. You don't hear it being said now, but because it's a fact, our manufacturing industry is all but defunct. So they replaced that with language suggesting that we want inward investment. This means we've failed our industry, so we're looking to other people to come here, and we believe they won't come unless we're part of the European Union. I believe that's gibberish, but then again, as I've said, so much of it is gibberish. Well, the next thing we have to do is, having left and being in a position to force our political so-called leaders to conduct themselves in an appropriate manner, we have to consider the party political system, which has failed us so badly, so very badly. I don't know what the numbers are, but I should say that any government in power, Labour, Conservative, doesn't really matter. If there are a dozen people making decisions about how we shall conduct ourselves or what we shall do or shan't do, then that is about as many as it is in any political party. So a population of 60-odd million is quite happy to accept the opinions of or the activities of 10 or a dozen people without really, and they've got a marvellous system at Westminster. You threaten people who disagree with you, so that if they want to stay part of your political setup, then by definition you have to do what they tell you. When I go to a ballot box, which I hasten to add, as I said, I don't these days. I'm not voting for something that's got no meaning. But if I vote at the ballot box along with a lot of other people and we elect an MP, and off he goes to Westminster, I expect him to be our MP. I don't expect him to go down there and say, now what may I say and what may I not say? Because an MP has a duty to the people who elect him, or her, of course, and that's forgotten. Now, the popping up to your constituency on a Friday and sorting out a few local problems is not representing the people. I mean, we might as well have the Citizens Advice Bureau can do that, or we put that in the hands of a local authority. We don't need an MP to do that. We need MPs to run the country, to govern. And that doesn't mean a dozen in this party or that party. It means the MPs in Parliament represent us and govern. Now, in order to do that, my next move is we don't need the House of Lords. Excuse me. We need a democratically structured House of Commons with about, say 300 MPs. It certainly doesn't want any more. Excuse me. And we need for them to elect a cabinet that is going to ask various of its members, elected by the sitting members of the House, to specialise in particular subjects, and then to bring their ideas to the floor of the House of Commons where they're debated. What we don't want is what we see now, which is 30 people in the House of Commons voting honourable this and honourable that, and then time for division, 400 in favour, 200 against. So what's all that about? Why have a debate on the floor of the House of Commons when the result of it has already been decided? There's no point in anybody turning up. There's no point in our paying for these people. So we have to change that. And if we're part of the so-called community, there's probably no opportunity for us to do that, because only by bringing pressure on our own elected MPs can we hope to see an improvement in performance. There's little point in having MPs at all if that's going to be the situation. I mean, they're simply a cipher for Germany or the EEC. And do we want that? And as I've said, we can't change that. We can't bring pressure to bear on Westminster without the freedom to do so. So I ask myself, does our government want to avoid that pressure? Do they feel that when they finish their so-called careers, they can trot off into the sun anyway and leave us to pick up the pieces? I've no idea. One hopes not. Let's take a brief look at Scotland as an example of what might happen. And let's suppose that after the referendum has taken place, the Scottish nationalists choose to announce that the statistics indicate that the majority of people in Scotland voted to remain within the Union, and even though the United Kingdom as a whole has voted to leave. Presumably, as they've taken care to, or decided to indicate, were this the case, they would wish to see, and they think this would justify it, that a further referendum takes place to decide whether or not Scotland becomes independent. Therefore, a country in its own right, it believes, as part of the European Union. Do you really believe that the people of Scotland, properly informed, I might add, would be in favour of opting out of a union with England, Wales and Northern Ireland, in favour of jumping into bed with Germany and, say, France, because France will go everywhere that Germany dictates? Because just think about what that means. Now, how many people are there in Scotland who are entitled to vote? What, say 3 million, 4 million? 3 to 4 at the most. Now, think about what then happens. Their borders, because they're then in a position where they need to expand and develop their industry as an independent nation, as part of the EC, which they claim they're totally in favour of. Extraordinary, but nonetheless true. Their borders are now open to what, 200-300 million people? I'm not suggesting they'll all head for Scotland, but some of them might well do so. How long do you think it will be before, potentially, so many people have settled in Scotland, and Scotland would be actively encouraging it then, one assumes, before there are no Scots in the Scottish government? Or at least if there are, a minority, a few perhaps. Now, do you think the Scottish people want that? I don't, not for a moment. So, will the Scottish government fully inform the Scottish people what faces them before the European referendum? I have to say that I don't expect them to do so. Indeed, I'd go further and say I'm not even sure that most of them actually are fully aware of what faces them if we do stay within this so-called union. And of course, this applies all equally to the politicians of England, Wales and Northern Ireland. They're more likely to be tempted to operate from the narrow confines of party-biased perspectives, which they always do. I can think of no reason why they'll change that. So what it means is that there'll be nothing, as I've said, nothing forthcoming from the politicians of the UK to inform the people, when, of course, the consequences of staying within it are so obvious that only a blind person would fail to see them. And I hasten to add, I reached these conclusions based entirely upon the performance of governments and political parties, or hierarchies within them, in terms of government itself, general elections, party leaderships, and so on. We've all seen them lie without batting an eye to us on a multitude of subjects. And I can think of no good reason why they'll change now. They look at the world from narrow, party, political, biased perspectives, and they're not likely to change. But I want to see us protect the identity of the countries of the United Kingdom far into the future. I can think of no good reason why we shouldn't. This is the United Kingdom, and it belongs to our children, grandchildren, and those who come afterwards. If we succumb to the European ideal, we might as well give all the countries numbers. The names of them will be irrelevant. We might as well remove our MPs. We don't need them. All we need is a few clerks who simply carry out the will of the Union, and more particularly of Germany. So if we're going to preserve the nation, or indeed move it into the future in a manner that really, I believe most of the British people want to see for their families and their families and their families and so on, we have to get into a situation where we can make demands of those who wish to be elected to represent us. This can't be served within political parties with all sorts of biases and rules that govern, and whips governing how these people choose to vote, or how these people don't choose to vote, more to the point. So I'm hoping that the people of the country will, or the United Kingdom, will realise what they're faced with. I mean, I'm just hoping that they will. I fear, of course, that nobody's going to listen to somebody like me putting forward a point of view, but it's so manifestly obvious that to go from the third country at the table with Russia and America at the end of the Second World War to one of a number is a very harsh, or accurate, of course, demonstration of the failure of our politicians and successive governments. I want to see that stop. And as I've said before, the first step is to opt out of the European Union, and then we must go on to reforming Parliament, etc., etc. But that, in a sense, is another subject. So I'll probably come back and say a bit more about one or two of my views, because, I mean, I'm just talking off the top of my head, and it could be that I've missed something important or failed to describe something in a way I'd like. But here we are. This is my point of view, and I hope you share it. Thank you.